So welcome everybody to the Center for Middle Eastern Studies Interdisciplinary Lecture Series. We're very happy to have Anne Broadbridge with us today, when she's joining us from the University of Massachusetts Amherst, where she's an associate professor of medieval Islamic history. She received her PhD from the University of Chicago and has received an impressive array of nominations and awards for teaching and research, including Ophir Wyatt Hayes, Grant Plain American Research Center in Egypt, the Dolores Zohrab Liebman Foundation, and the Marian and Jasper Whiting Foundation. Her research focuses on two fields. First, the Mamluk Sultanate, with a particular interest in diplomacy and ideology, and second, the Mongol Empire, especially ideology, women, and politics. She teaches on the Mongols, the Crusades, the Ottomans, early Islamic history, and Islamic thought. And just an aside here, that those of us who teach Middle Eastern history, we're somehow supposed to be responsible for things as vast and as different as, I don't even know what the equivalent would be, like American Revolution and contemporary Poland. I mean,
yes.
Yet somehow we're expected to have expertise in this, and you're someone who has really cultivated expertise in two very different and very difficult fields. Anne is the author of Kingship and Ideology in the Islamic and Mongol Worlds, published by Cambridge University Press, in which she examined the conflicting ideas of kingship that the Mamluk Sultans of Egypt and Syria exchanged through diplomacy with Mongol and Turkish rulers in southern Russia, Central Asia, and Iran. She's currently finishing her second book, Imperial Women in the Mongol Empire, which she'll share parts of today with us. Her lecture this evening, Professor Broadbridge will bring us to the easternmost reaches of our world area focus here at the Center for Middle Eastern Studies. And of course, the Middle East has very elastic boundaries, so we're happy to accommodate North Africa, the Sahel, Central Asia, whatever is interesting, and this is certainly interesting for us. And it's our great pleasure to co-sponsor this event with the UC Berkeley Mongolia Initiative, a new venture spearheaded by our colleagues at the Institute for East Asian Studies. So thank you for joining us for that. So without any more ado, Anne Broadbridge.
Okay. All right, well, thank you very much for that charming introduction. I am grateful to you in particular, Dr. Godrich, for inviting me to speak in this lecture series. And I'm grateful to the Center for Middle Eastern Studies for this opportunity, and to Lydia Kiesling, Amber Zambelli, and Neil Gali for making all the arrangements very cheerfully to bring me here. So this afternoon I'll talk with you about women in the Mongol Empire, and I think I already know the answer from listening to your conversations beforehand, but nevertheless I'll ask the question: how many of you have read, watched, or otherwise encountered something on the Mongols recently or ever? So obviously that would be a lot of you, and I'm very glad. As you therefore already know, the Mongol Empire itself inspires tremendous interest. There is modern interest, which we see these days in popular books: the Mongol Queens, Lords of the Bow, Bones of the Hills. There are a bunch more, Something of the Something. It's a nice title. On the Trail of Genghis Khan, which is Life, Death, and Resurrection. I'm not certain what the resurrection part is. These are all on my shelf, so this gives you some slight idea of modern interest. And of course, we see interest through movies, usually made by Asian cinema houses or film industries. So this is a shot from the Russian-Kazakh combined program on the Mongols, or History Channel documentaries, which my students like to cite to me. And finally, we have modern interest in the Netflix Marco Polo series. Season 1 was in 2014-2015. Series 2 was last July, and the big question is, when will Season 3 start? I haven't watched this, but my students like to watch it and then tell me what they think of it, which is mixed. So have any of you seen it? I'd like to see what you guys think of it. I'm really curious. So even at the time of Genghis Khan himself, people were interested in him, although usually for reasons of fear, which we don't share. So we have works like The History of the World Conqueror in Persian, The Secret History of the Mongols in Mongolian written in Chinese characters, and The History of the Nation of the Archers in Armenian, to give you some sense of the vast interest in Genghis Khan from then until now. Now, as usually told, the story of the Mongol Empire is largely the triumphal story of Genghis Khan himself. And that is with good reason. It is an astonishing story. He was born in perhaps 1167 on the Mongolian steppe, and he rose out of tremendous poverty. He and his family ate nothing but marmots, which are kind of a prairie dog, and wild onions for years. And if you're eating marmots and wild onions, then you're really quite poor in that particular society. Then from the 1180s until 1206, Genghis Khan worked very hard to unite the bitterly warring nomadic groups of Mongolia into one extraordinary army. Thereafter, as you know, he took that army off on a remarkable series of conquests in China and the Middle East. So these are his conquests in red. After Genghis Khan's death in 1227, his family continued his conquests, here marked in purple, until they controlled the area you see shaded in red, which is usually described as, and I quote, the largest contiguous land empire in history. And you hear that phrase all the time when you talk about the Mongols. So, did I say triumphal? Well, now, I myself have taught Mongol history for about 15 years. And at a certain point, I observed that this triumphal story is largely one of what men do. And so I began to investigate women. And I soon realized that I could just as easily talk about this woman, Berte, as I could talk about Genghis Khan himself. Now, Berte was Genghis Khan's senior wife. She was known in her youth as a girl who had light in her face, who had fire in her eyes. That's from The Secret History. Her influence on the Mongol Empire was also tremendous, even though we hear much less about her. So this afternoon, what I'll do, therefore, is set aside Genghis Khan in favor of certain key women in his life. First, Berte, then her 5 daughters, and finally Berte's daughter-in-law, Sorkaktani. I'll illustrate the influence of these women on Mongol history with 3 topics: work in Mongol society, Genghis Khan's army reform and conquests, and the question of succession to the position of Great Khan. So let's begin with the topic of work in Mongol society. Now, so far, as we know, the historical studies of the Mongol have focused largely on men. And in Genghis Khan's society, men's work was to take care of everything having to do with war. And this is how we know the triumphal narrative, because it is a war narrative. So men trained the horses they rode in war. They made political alliances with which to conduct war. And they went hunting to prepare for war. When I say hunting, what I'm describing, or what I'm talking about, are these large 3-month-long campaigns, expeditions with hundreds or thousands of men, where they practiced the logistics of military campaigns. And so everyone had to be in a strategic position for a period of 3 months, and then they'd close in on the animals, eventually encircling them and getting to a point where they could simply stop and shoot them all. And they communicated during these 3 months by rapid messenger and smoke signal. It was really very elaborate, organized, and disciplined. The Mongols then used these expeditions, these hunting expeditions, where they hunted animals, to practice the exact techniques they would then use against human enemies, which we see repeatedly in the sources. After all of this preparation, so getting their horses ready, getting their political alliances ready, and practicing the logistical and the tactical movements they needed, men would then simply go and fight. So the question naturally is, what were women doing while men were fighting? Women's work was to do everything else. So, for example, they managed the home, the yurt or ger. Yurt is Turkish, ger is Mongolian. They managed the camp, which was many yurts or gers together. They took care of all the other animals. We have here sheep, goats, and there are a few cattle on the right-hand side. Also oxen, sometimes camels. Women dealt with food. They dealt with children, which is bearing them, raising them, and then marrying them off well. They were busy with trade. They traded both with traveling merchants, and they would give a portion of their own capital to merchants to then take away and trade for them. And the merchant, if he did well, would bring back the profit. Finally, women were responsible for the twice-yearly migration. That is to say that women, twice a year, they would pick up the entire camp, they'd move it somewhere else, and then 6 months later, they'd move it back again. So if you're curious about the logistics of this, when Berthe began as Genghis Khan's senior wife, their camp had a few gers or yurts. 30 years later, it had, and I quote, hundreds and thousands of wagons and tents. Furthermore, when a ruler with multiple wives went off to fight, one of his wives accompanied him to create a traveling camp, and then the other wives remained in the main camp, running it for months as years, or years as long as it was needed. So what we learned from this is that the work and management that women did every day is what permitted men to specialize in warfare. Men were not necessary to daily life because women managed it all. That was their job. Allow me to quote a Franciscan visitor to the Mongols in 1245 on this point, quote, "The wives do all the work, while the men make nothing but arrows and practice shooting with bows." Now let me point out that in no other contemporary society do we see a situation where men can specialize in warfare to this degree. Not in medieval China, nor medieval Iran, nor medieval Europe. In those regions, men engage in a range of tasks. They're priests or holy people, they're merchants, they're artisans, they're farmers, and then a few of them are warriors. Among the Mongols, by contrast, men are almost exclusively warriors. Why? Because all other societal tasks are largely handled by women. So to sum up, in the beginning of Genghis Khan's career, which is the 1180s to about 1203, there was Berthe. And in accordance with Mongol ideas about work, after her wedding to Genghis Khan in 1182, Berthe took over management of their camp. Berthe's work is what gave Genghis Khan the freedom he needed to engage in politics and war. That is, prepare his horses, form his alliances, subdue his warring neighbors, and thereafter create his empire. Which is to say that without Berthe managing everything else in his life, Genghis Khan would not have been free to do much of anything. Now, this was true for the 1180s and the 1190s. And then in 1203, Genghis Khan developed an imperial guard, or the Keshig, which had about 10,000 people in it. The guardsmen were responsible for certain activities. They had to guard the prince and his family. They had to take care of the imperial animals. They had to work in the imperial kitchens or supervise that work, depending. They had to supervise some of the servants. And they had to maintain imperial weapons and the carts that moved into imperial possessions from place to place. Finally, they helped distribute spoils. Now, you may be wondering why is part of the slide in blue and part of it is in black. The reason for that is that the blue indicates those areas where the guardsmen's duties overlapped with wifely duties. And so what this leads us to is the position of the camp commander, the Emir Ulus. This is an officer in the imperial guard who is appointed in the camp of a wife. For domestic matters, he answers to the wife. And then for military matters, he answers to her husband, who is his chief officer. What this tells us is that at the beginning, women managed the camp, but it was on a relatively small scale. As the empire grows, however, so did Berthe's staff and the staff of women like her. From 1203 on, part of that staff was made up of imperial guardsmen. And some of the people that women later became responsible for could be as many as about 10,000 people. Our next topic is Genghis Khan's famous army reform and his equally famous conquests. And here we will look at the contributions made by Berthe's children. Now, most historians describe Berthe as the mother of 4 sons, Jochi, Chagatai, Ögedei, Tolui. But in fact, Berthe was the mother of 9 children, not 4. So here are the 5 daughters, Kojin, Chechiagan, Alaka, Chimelun, and Al-Altan. Berthe's sons all worked for their father as major commanders in his armies during the years of the famous Mongol conquests. But before those conquests even began, Berthe's daughters were instrumental to the way that Genghis Khan reformed his army and therefore was able to undertake his conquests. So let's take a look. Before Genghis Khan, when a nomadic ruler was conquering other neighboring nomads, what he would do is he would conquer some nomadic people, and then he would incorporate them into his own armies, or kill them, but more often they were incorporated. So there's nothing particularly new or special about this. However, Genghis Khan, when he comes along, he conquered people, then he reorganized them, and then he incorporated them into his armies. This reorganization was the key to his later conquests and his well-deserved and lasting reputation. Now the question is, how did he do it? Well, previous nomadic armies had formed in confederations much of the time. So, for example, you would take the Mongols on the one side and another nomadic group, say the Karaites, an actual group, and then you would have two rulers, Genghis Khan on the one hand and On Khan, the leader of the Karaites, on the other, and these two would be allied with one another. Then you'd have two sets of troops, often organized by decimals. So it was like two armies joined side by side, or two armies side by side joined loosely at the top by their leadership. When Genghis Khan was conquering neighboring nomadic groups, he did away with this confederation formation, and he instituted a surprisingly modern army with interchangeable parts, which we call usually the atomized army. Okay, so let me explain how this one works. Before Genghis Khan, as we just saw, we have soldiers from one nomadic group, say the Karaites. They'd be organized in units. They'd all be Karaites. They'd know each other, at least distantly, etc. In Genghis Khan's new system, by contrast, the soldiers were mixed up, whence the name atomization. And so I've given the example of a unit of 10, which is the smallest unit. Rather than having 10 Karaites in a unit, you would have, say, 2 Karaites, 3 Mongols, 3 Naimans, 1 Seljuk, and 1 Durban. Okay, so they're atomized. That is to say, they're all mixed up and together. With this new atomizing system, Genghis Khan broke up all of the nomadic peoples he conquered. And he spread them out within his armies. And in this way, those peoples could not rise against him because they could not unite with one another, being as they were scattered. Furthermore, Genghis Khan kept them down with very severe discipline. So previously, you were supposed to cooperate when someone gave you an order, and generally you did, but it depended a lot on the personality of the man you worked for. Under Genghis Khan, you were required to be obedient or die. So let me give you an example of what that looks like. Let's say, looking at the unit of 10 over there, let's say the 3 Naimans want to go and visit their cousins who are in a different unit, and they go without permission. The result of this is, first, the Naimans themselves are hunted down and killed. Then, the other guys, the Karaites, Seljuk, Mongols, and Durban, who let them go, are also punished severely, which could be fatal. Finally, the people they went to, that is the Naimans in some other unit, they're punished because they received them, and possibly the other guys in the unit might die as well, just to set an example. So when I say severe discipline, I do mean severe. In this system, people largely followed orders once they saw what it meant if you didn't. Okay, I know this is a talk on women. Where am I going with this? Don't worry. So Genghis Khan reformed his armies. This is the key to his success. We've got the atomized army down here at the bottom with about somewhere between 95 and 120,000 men. And up we've got that Imperial Guard I mentioned earlier up at the top as a sort of a check or balance. And in this system, those nomadic groups that Genghis Khan has conquered, before he goes out on his big world conquests, they've all been atomized. The nomadic groups have been shattered, and so they cannot rise against him, right? This is the theory. This is like the before picture, before you add women in. Now let's go back to Berthe and her daughters and look at where women fit in this system, because surprisingly they do. We know that the 4 boys, the 4 sons, worked for their dad and his armies, fine. What did the girls do? Genghis Khan and Berthe married all 5 of them to Genghis Khan's political allies. All of these were rulers. These sons-in-law, imperial sons-in-law, the word is cute again, got special privileges. First, they received a princess who would, in the spirit of Mongol division of labor by gender, manage their camps, their flocks, their children, their animals, their migrations. That was their job. In the army, they would join Genghis Khan's army when marrying one of his daughters. They got larger units. So the larger unit that we saw before, the top unit was 1,000. Here they're between 2,000 and 18,000. So the units they controlled were larger, and they got to keep their own men. That is, they were not atomized. Finally, they got opportunities, which is a chance to fight with their father-in-law, Genghis Khan. So of all the nomadic leaders around, which one would you want to work for? The one who was the most successful, and that was Genghis Khan. The princesses, that is Berte's daughters, first of all became queens through their marriages. Second, they received wealth, respect, position, etc. And finally, they had the opportunity to support the expanding empire and benefit from the spoils. So what this means is that the princesses and their husbands form what we can call the Chinggisid Confederation, which is Genghis Khan and Berke on the one hand, and then Kojin, the first daughter, and her husband, Menebuttu, Chechi again and her husband, Alaka and her husbands, that actually should be a plural, she had several, Tümelün and her husband, Al-Altan, the fifth daughter, and her husband, and Berte's brothers, by the way. So once we add women to the picture of army reform, we can no longer say that Genghis Khan came along, destroyed the nomadic groups, formed an army, and then went off and fought with them. That's not true. Instead, he did all of these things, but he also inserted an old-fashioned confederation-style army into his forces, which was above the atomized army, but either below or perhaps separate from the imperial guard. And this confederation was populated by his womenfolk, his daughters and their husbands, with benefits to all parties. So the structure of army reform changes significantly once you put women in the picture. Now, once Genghis Khan built up his military forces, what did he do with them? As we know, he took them off on the Mongol conquests. Before the conquests even begin, let's look at the impact of the princesses. So here's Genghis Khan. After all of the girls get married, several territories join the Mongols immediately. That is, the Mongols conquer certain regions where the princesses have become queens, and they do so peacefully without spending a single Mongol life. So the girls are immediately useful to their parents simply by getting married. After this convenient and peaceful expansion of territory, Genghis Khan moves on to crack the harder nuts. I'm only going to mention two of his campaigns. One is into northern China, and one is into the eastern Islamic world against the Khwarezm Shah Empire. So let's start with northern China. The key to northern China was the Ürgüt kingdom of sedentary Turks who lived on the border, in the border region between the Jin Empire and the nomads. The key to the Ürgüts was the third daughter, Alaka. Alaka married 3 or possibly 4 Ürgüt rulers in succession. We don't actually know how many. They all died on her of natural causes. And eventually she just took over the kingdom and ruled as a queen at home and as a, as a governor for her parents. The first time the Mongols invaded China in 1211, the Ürgüts held the border region, but they let the Mongols through and sent 10,000 men with them. By this point, Alaka was already married. Thereafter, many other sons-in-law fought in this campaign, that is, the husbands of Kojin, Tümelün, and the brothers of Berke. And some of these sons-in-law brought their wives with them on the campaign. So the daughters were there during the campaign. Then, when Genghis Khan withdrew victorious in 1215, he left behind a second army to continue the invasion of China towards the south. The general in charge had 23,000 nomadic troops, and of them, 19,000 were led by Genghis Khan's in-laws. Furthermore, the logistical supplier for the entire campaign was none other than the queen of the borderlands, Alaka, who was now a widow and ruling independently for the empire. Meanwhile, Genghis Khan went off to attack the eastern Islamic world. There we go. Here we see a similar story. First, Genghis Khan's in-laws show up with 25,000 men. So these are the husbands of Al-Altan, the Uyghurs, and Chechi, again, the Oirats. These husbands fought in several major battles during the campaign, and it appears that their princess wives may have accompanied them as well. So, whereas Berthe was of signal importance in freeing Genghis Khan to go and fight, Berthe's daughters and their husbands and troops played major roles both in the way that Genghis Khan structured his armies and in his campaigns of conquest. For our last case study, I'll bring in our last woman, Berthe's daughter-in-law, Sorkaktani. This is a modern image taken from a museum, the Museum of the Imperial Wives, which is in sort of northeastern Mongolia. So the clothes are typical of what she would have worn. And the pictures you saw earlier were all historical portraits. This is a modern one done in a sort of new historical style, if you will. So let's go back to our family tree. Now, for simplicity's sake, I've trimmed out the women, which may alarm you, but don't worry, Sorkaktani will come in. So the reason I've taken the women out is that after Genghis Khan died in 1227, Berthe's daughters, all 5 of them, remained in their kingdoms. Okay, and it was Berthe's sons, Jochi, Chagatai, Ögedei, and Tolui, who inherited Genghis Khan's empire. By the time that we get to Sorkaktani, whose activities were really in the 1240s, all of these sons had died. And so what we're looking at is the story of their successors, their families. So, after Genghis Khan died, his third son, Ögedei, took over after him as Great Khan. After Ögedei's own death, the next ruler was his son, Gyük, who ruled for a couple of years in the 1240s. In 1248, Gyük was on the throne, but he died suddenly of drinking too much. Both Gyük and Ögedei were serious alcoholics. This allows Sorkaktani to enter the picture politically. Now, Sorkaktani was the widow of Berthe's 4th son, Tolui, who had by this time, obviously he had died since she was a widow. In 1248, shortly before Gyük's death, Sorkaktani engaged in a treasonous alliance with the family of Berthe's first son, Jochi, up at the top there, who had also died. So again, we're dealing with the family, not the son himself. So Sorkaktani engages in a treasonous alliance with the Jochids. And after Gyük's death in 1248, the plotters, these 2 families, the Toluids and the Jochids, work together. They oppose the families of Chagatai and Ögedei, the other 2 families. They maneuvered Sorkaktani's oldest son onto the throne by 1251. And then, to keep Sorkaktani's son on the throne, they executed almost all of the Chagataids and the Ögedeids as traitors. This crippled the Chinggisid family. By 1260, the empire no longer looked like this, that is, one and unified, but rather it was 4 independent, smaller empires. And here the green, the yellow, and the purple were all held by the plotters, whereas that piddly orange thing in the middle there was held by the few remaining stragglers from those 2 families who had been allowed to live. Usually they were very young. Furthermore, in the 1260s, within a very short time of this dismemberment, all 4 of these empires soon were at war with one another. Oh my. So the question is, why did this happen? Well, just as historians working on the Mongols had not considered what women did all day long, this brings us to Berthe, nor had they considered who women married and why it mattered, which brings us to the daughters, so too historians had not considered what women were thinking about and where their loyalties lay. When we start to investigate women's loyalties, things do become interesting. Now, here we go. Okay. Do you remember how Genghis Khan created his army in part by destroying other nomadic groups, by atomizing them, spreading them out through his armed forces, etc.? Well, Sorkaktani's people were among those. They were the Karaites. Sorkaktani was a Karaite princess. Her father, Jakagambu, so her father, her mother, her uncle, her aunts, all of them ruled the Karaite people. And then the Mongols came along, and in 1203 they killed her father, her uncle, and many of her male cousins. Thereafter, her people, watch the Karaite people, her people were atomized among the Mongol armies in the process that we've already seen. And then finally, Sorkaktani and her sisters were married into the Chinggisid family. So Sorkaktani is what I like to call a conquered wife. No one stopped to think about where her loyalty lay. No one really cared. But I would argue it does not appear to have been with the family she married into. Okay. After Genghis Khan had died, after the next generation had died, right around the time of Guyuk, so 1248 or so, Sorkaktani began to see some opportunity. Now, I mentioned earlier, Sorkaktani plotted with the family of Jochi against those two families in the middle. People wonder sometimes, well, why did these two families communicate so well with each other? It does not appear to have been an accident that Sorkaktani's sister was one of the many wives of her brother-in-law, Jochi. So we have two sons with Karaite wives, and their families are very close and are plotting together. They together maneuvered Sorkaktani's son onto a throne he had no business holding whatsoever. They then advised him to purge the remaining two families. And the purges in the historical sources, which were written by the victors, so the Toloids, they are described in this really great way as, we had this coronation and everything was great, and then those guys, sorry, the ones I've just taken down, those guys showed up and they were going to fight with us. They were not obedient. So we had to kill them. It was tragic. It was really sad. We had to kill them in self-defense because otherwise, who knows what would have happened. But we never otherwise would have laid a hand on them. This is what the winners would have you believe, that this was a reactionary slaughter of two entire families. The number of people dead was perhaps 500 family members, which doesn't seem like a big number until you ask yourself, do you have 500 people in your family? I don't. So it's a lot of people. If it's from one family, that doesn't count their supporters, their soldiers, etc. So if you think that this is reactionary, then it just looks like Tolui has done what he needed to do to keep himself safe. But the evidence that I've seen suggests to me that this was planned in advance. That is to say that Sorkaktani and Beg Tutmish and their Sorkaktani's son knew that at some point it might be necessary to remove these other two families entirely in order to secure their hold on the throne. When the dust had settled, Sorkaktani's son had become Great Khan. Her family was restored to the royalty she had been born into and then had lost. But the Chinggisid family, and I'll take them out again, was in tatters. I'm going to sum up now. Berte, her daughters, and other women were profoundly influential on the creation of the Mongol Empire. First of all, women's daily labor, especially Berte, allowed men, especially Genghis Khan, to specialize in war. Thereafter, Berte's daughters made political marriages, which allowed Genghis Khan and Berte to create a confederation of in-laws just when all other nomadic groups were being shattered and atomized. Genghis Khan relied on these sons-in-law and at times on his daughters to play significant roles in the Mongol conquests. Then came Sorkaktani, a conquered woman with hidden loyalties. She was a victim of Genghis Khan's very same drastic reorganization policies, and she was brought into the Chinggisid family at the cost of her father, her uncle, and her people. Sorkaktani helped rip apart the very empire that Genghis Khan and Berte had built. And to close, I would just like to show you a picture of the Museum of Imperial Women in Mongolia. It's the red building in the center. And as you may notice from the portrait, which is from inside the museum, on the right-hand side, the museum is built in the shape of an imperial woman's hat. So it's the only museum in the world I've ever seen that looks like a hat. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. A great lecture. We have plenty of time for questions.
It's a few, I want to say 2005. It's not very old.
No, it's new. So
Yeah.
there is a resurgence of interest in the women now, or personalities.
There's a resurgence of interest. There's a lot of reimagining. So the museum itself has no historical value. The exhibits inside don't tell you anything about the historical picture, but they tell you a lot about how modern Mongolians are reimagining the women back then to play some kind of useful role for them today. And when I was in Mongolia last spring, most of the exhibits I saw on the imperial period suffered from this sort of, there are a lot of images, pictures, artifacts that were brand new, created to give you a sense of what it would have been like. But there was very little that was actually historical at all. So the museum is great. I mean, when do you get to go into a museum that looks like that? And the caretaker has quite a lot to say, and it's very interesting to listen to him, but it tells you about modern understandings and doesn't tell you anything about the actual historical picture. So. Yes?
Just one quick question, one longer question. My quick question is, was there any kind of, did you ever find evidence of women joining warfare, and how strict were those gender lines?
Mm-hmm.
And my other question is more to do with how it's not easy to get at women in these histories, so how did you do this? What kind of sources did you use? I mean, you say that the museum doesn't have sources really, or
No.
there aren't artifacts, or are there but they're not there. So what kind of sources did you use, and how did you go about piecing together this history?
So, to answer your first question, it appears that some women may indeed have fought. A couple of my colleagues have worked on this topic, and I've seen a little bit of what they've done. One person who has more on this has actually just sent me the proofs of his books, so as soon as I read them on the plane home, I will know what he says systematically. But there is evidence that some women did get to go and fight. There's evidence of certain princesses who really would rather fight than do all of the many things that women had to do at home. So yes, there are definitely cases of this. We also have references to the Mongols doing things like, for example, when they're going into a battle, mounting up women, children, and also straw dummies to make their numbers look bigger. So that, I don't think they went into the battle, but they were nearby to give the impression. We also know that, of course, as I said earlier, when Genghis Khan went to war, one of his wives would go with him to create a traveling camp for him. And so there were women present on a lot of these campaigns, even though it's not mentioned in the sources. But you get a little from here and a little from there, and eventually you can piece it together. It does require a lot of imagination combined with rigorous historical work. It's a bit of a challenge. Now, to address your question on the sources, on the one hand, many of the major sources on the Mongols, the Secret History of the Mongols, Rashid ad-Din, who wrote the Compendium of Chronicles, which is a Persian history, Juvaini, who wrote the History of the World Conqueror, many of these, some of the Arabic writers, somewhat the Chinese authors, they say a bit about women, it's scraps, but you can still work with it. They all talk about women at various points. And in particular, they talk about the big personalities, some of which we saw today. There were others. A very famous one was in the 1240s, Turigene, who was another conquered woman, and who also put a son onto the throne where he didn't necessarily have any business being there. That was Guyuk's mother. So she's another interesting question. So the sources write about these women, and what you can do is you can look at what the Secret History says, which the Secret History is very difficult to work with. It's really interesting, but it's very difficult. Then you can look at what Rashid ad-Din says. Rashid ad-Din is my favorite author for Mongol women because he says the most, yet he lies, or he hides things, or he'll tell you the truth in one place, and then he'll lie in a different place, and so you have to compare the two of them. So, for example, Bertain Genghis Khan's fifth daughter, Al-Altan, married the ruler of the Uyghurs, the Idikut, whose name is Barkchuk. And then later on, she went to her brother's court, Urgadai's court, and Urgadai died, and she was accused of poisoning him, held for a while, and then eventually put to death when Guyuk took over. This is written out of the sources. So Rashid ad-Din is particularly good on her because he has her marrying somebody completely different. But if you compare him with the secret history and the Chinese sources, you realize that he's lying. And he prevaricates about the fact that she was murdered. So then to discover that she was murdered, you have to look at the European sources, which I've not yet mentioned. Those are European travelers who have come usually from, in one case, the Pope, in another case, King Louis IX of France, to plead with the Mongols to go away or to let them take prisoners home. And so they have travelers' reports, which are very useful. And there's, of course, the friars Carpini and William. There are others as well. So between those authors, the European sources, and Rashid ad-Din not fitting the other ones, you can figure out that Rashid ad-Din is lying. And then once you know that he's lying, you can guess what it is he's trying to cover up. But it's really kind of a detective game. First you have to figure out that he is lying, and then you have to figure out what it is that is so important it needs to be hidden in his official history, which was written for one of Genghis Khan's descendants. Another place where Rashid ad-Din lies, for example, is about Berthe. Her oldest boy, so her second kid, Jochi, might have been someone else's kids, not Genghis Khan. There was a kidnap. She was kind of away for a while. She came back and had this baby. You know, she and Genghis Khan both said, yeah, she was pregnant beforehand, but you can't tell. So there's always this mystery about the first boy, and that's a great one because the secret history has one story, which is problematic, but you can work with it. And then Rashid ad-Din has a different story, and he, of course, lies about it. So he says, well, naturally she was pregnant first, of course, because she was a good wife, and you know. And then when she went, no one had sex with her because they wouldn't have done that. And he goes to these elaborate lengths, but because you can piece together the story from elsewhere, you can see where he's lying. But so these are the sources I'm working with. So some are wrong. Some are, and they're all biased in one way or the other, that's to be expected. But then you've got these moments of inconsistency which do make things more interesting. Because once you discover a lie, then you think, well, what's really going on here? I may be able to get at it. It requires a lot of sort of cross-checking of the sources against themselves and against one another. And then you just have to imagine. I mean, I thought, when I first started the project, I thought, what were women doing all day long? We've got this triumphal narrative. Why is it where were the women in this? And once I began to look, I began to find scraps here and scraps there that allowed me to piece together a picture. But unlike in my first book, for example, a lot of it I had to put together with guesswork and a lot of work sort of comparing things to come up with a picture. It's a lot harder than my first book, I have to say. So, yes. Yes, please.
Okay, so my question is, when Sorghum staged this coup,
Mm-hmm.
what was the reaction of people within Jochi and the Jochis and the Tolui camps? Like, was there consensus about this coup? And
Yeah.
also, what was the reaction of the generals? Independent, not independent, but unaffiliated.
There weren't well, I'm not sure we could say that there were independent generals, at least not for very long. The reactions among, say, the ordinary soldiers, I don't think we can get at that necessarily. As far as we know, however, both camps, so the Jochid camp with its various inhabitants, men and women, and also the Toluid camp, the loyalties are clear when they get to the coronation or Kurultai of 1251, and you see who shows up. So the Toluids are there in force. Of course, their guy's going to be on the throne. Naturally, they're there. The Jochids are not there completely in force because the Jochid ruler has to stay at home. He's got health problems. But he sends several of his brothers and an army with them, which is another way you can guess at perhaps these coups. The purges were premeditated because they have an army allegedly to keep the peace, but it reads very much like a whitewashing after the fact. So they are definitely there. What ordinary soldiers thought was irrelevant because they're not exactly free to express their opinions in this society, and so they're really required to do what their leaders are telling them they do. The generals split. Some went with the two houses that were soon overthrown. They died for it, usually. Especially the higher you were, the more likely you were to die. And then other generals made the right guess, frankly, and went with the plotters, and they survived. Have I answered your question?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, please.
Thanks. My unrelated question.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned that nobody was paying attention to Sukhothai, and she was able to do this. So my question is that, you know, modern historians that don't pay attention to what she was doing, to what extent was she really, you know, incorporated, did the rest of the Chinggisid family consider her incorporated into their family? The other daughters, the other sons,
Okay.
or descendants?
So in part, no one realizes that she's plotting until it's a little bit late, except the other plotters, as far as we know from the incomplete sources written by historians who worked for her descendants. So obviously the information on her is difficult to work with, but that's okay. How did she relate to the Chinggisid family? In Chinggisid family terms, she was the widow of a younger son. She didn't really, I mean, she was respected and all. She had lands. People admired her personally. She had this great reputation as being very diplomatic, savvy, a great administrator, which the Mongols were at that point not very good at being sometimes. She had a lot of skill, so people admired that about her. She was said to be a great mother to her sons, although I think that might have been some more whitewashing. The picture of her is really quite rosy, then again, her side won. However, she was the widow of Tolui, the fourth son, and the succession had passed to a different line, to the Ögedeiid line. There was no reason for it. It had gone first to Ögedei, Genghis Khan's son, as you know, and then to his son, Guyuk. Now that was forced a bit by Guyuk's mother, but it looked to all eyes as though succession should remain in the Ögedeiid line. So there was really no particular argument for why Sorkhoktani's son should come out of nowhere and take over this job that was not his to take over. Which is why I think there had to be purges after the fact, because it was a coup. It's presented in the history as sort of a, you know, the rightful ruler finally took over and the Ögedeids had problems with them, so it was right and proper that Möngke, Sorkhoktani's son, finally came to the throne. But again, this is whitewashing after the fact. It was simply a coup that was successful. Now, how did Sorkhoktani interact with other members of the family? So we see how she ranks in sort of the houses of the boys who inherit the empire. With the girls, with the daughters, she is very careful in her politics, and so she marries one of the daughters, the second one, Chechi, again, marries into the Oirat people and has a lot of children. And Sorkhoktani marries a couple of her kids to that woman's children, to Chechigan's children, and so creates a link with Chechigan and the Oirats and Chechigan's husband, all of whom support her when the coup comes. So the Oirats come down on the side of the people to whom their princesses are married. Probably not an accident. So she does make strategic connections to the daughters who are not players in succession. I mean, they have no way to become rulers. Their sons are not going to become rulers except in their own territories. They can't inherit the empire. I'm not sure I've answered your question, have I?
Well, part of the question is it even, how possible is it to say whether, you know, these, I mean, you implied that the conquered wives really still their loyalties still lay elsewhere than their married-in family. And I'm just wondering how that escaped the attention of the wives and mothers who themselves had been in these positions and knew what that politics was about, right? So why did they drop the ball in that respect?
That's a good question. So the daughters of Berthe were not in the same position because they didn't get to choose who they married, but they had proper marriages with proper ceremonies, and there was no enslavement or capture or people dispersed, none of that. Okay, so the position is different. However, we do know that in the 1240s, we think that in the 1240s, this is one of the things that's been cut out of both the Secret History and Rashid ad-Din, the daughters were somewhat disinherited. Berthe's daughters were supposed to be rewarded with various things as part of being part of the empire, and that was true while their father was alive, but then in the 1240s their brother Ögedei seems to have started to cut down on their inheritance or their rights. Now exactly what he did we don't know because it's cut out. I think this is probably why his sister was accused of poisoning him and was murdered. And Chechigan's children also. I mean, why is she siding with the usurpers? There's a part of the Secret History that says, and then the imperial daughters were given their inheritances footnote, this section has been cut from the text. So it appears that something, and there are some other stories as well that support this, but it appears that the daughters were being disinherited, and therefore, whether or not they fully grasped everything that Sorkaktani was up to, it was in their interest to throw in their lot against the Ögedayid house, which was disinheriting them as well. Does that make more sense? Yeah. The other conquered women, Turagene, who's Guyuk's mother, similarly, you can't prove loyalty. I mean, it's not written down anywhere, you have to guess, which is one of the frustrations of working on a topic like this. But if you look at behavior, I mean, Sorkaktani is always often described in the sources, and sometimes by modern historians who pick it up from the sources, as this lovely, grand, talented, wonderful woman with so many skills. She was just really, everyone should wish to be like her. One of the quotes is, you know, if all women were like her, then there would be no point in men existing in the world, something like this. I mean, the people just loved her. So she clearly was exceedingly skilled. But it's easy to look at what she accomplishes and see it as accomplishment rather than what she's actually doing to the Chinggisid Empire, which is destroying half of it. I mean, half of the ruling family is gone in a couple of months. Tell me that wasn't premeditated. So. Other questions? Yes?
Well, I always envision this incredible army on the move with the women with the earths bringing them, you know, the supply chain, all of that. Do you have any sense that the soldier, the ordinary fighter, with his wife or multiple wives, also went along? Or did the capital was just an enormous, the women left behind kind of thing? Did all these women go with them? Because I know some of them did.
Yeah. So I can't tell you exactly who gets to bring his wife along. This isn't entirely clear. However, if you look at the larger campaigns, so the campaigns of conquest, there are two into China in 1209, 1210, and then 1211 to 1215, which we looked at, and then there's the one into the Eastern Islamic world. The pattern of those campaigns is generally that the Mongols would come into a region and they would establish a camp where the women were living, and then they would go out on short expeditions and come back to it. There would also be long periods of time during the campaigns. If you start to look at the dates of battles, and this is especially clear after Genghis Khan's death when they're conquering across Central Asia into Russia and eventually into Eastern Europe, the battles are largely in the winter. And then from spring through summer, they have to fatten up the horses. You can't ride your horse all year, and also the mares might be foaling. And the Mongols preferred to ride mares or geldings in battle because they're much more cooperative. So you cannot fight all year long. And if you actually look at battle dates, they tend to be in the winter, not always, but they're often in the winter, and then there's a long gap while they're in whatever temporary central camp they've made, or moving it, and they're planning the next part of their campaign, they're doing strategy, they're having banquets, they're drinking a lot. All of this is necessary in order to get ready for the next part. So there's a lot of movement, but there's less than it actually looks like. They're not constantly on the move. They move for a while, stop, make a camp, do expeditions from it, return to it, fatten up the horses, let them foal, wait till they're done foaling, wait till the foals stop drinking milk, then they make alcohol for a while, they have parties, they plan. I mean, all these things are very seasonal, and then in the winter they move again and do another campaign. So it's not constant motion, and there is a place for women to be if they're not actually, you know, on the front lines during all of these big campaigns. Have I answered your question?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, yes?
Sorry, I just wanted to ask, what books or sources would you recommend looking at if you were more interested?
So all the ones I've mentioned thus far, The Secret History of the Mongols, and it depends on what languages you can read, obviously. No one can read enough, unfortunately, but, you know. So there's The Secret History of the Mongols, which is there are good translations of it. It's also in Mongolian and Chinese characters, if you can read that, and also in Mongolian. There are the various Chinese sources. There are a couple of diplomatic reports from the 1220s and the 1230s, which are good. Then there's the Yuan Shi, which is a Chinese dynastic history of the Yuan dynasty, the Mongols in China, which has problems, but you still need to look at. I don't read Chinese, so I've had parts of that translated, but so I haven't read the whole 12 volumes or whatever it is. Let's see. There is also a lot of later folklore collections and epic stories, which are useful to look at for the ethos of the time, even though they come from a later period. So that's where you start. That's sort of the eastern end of the sources. There are Tibetan sources, but I can't read Tibetan at all, so I don't know anything about the Tibetan sources. There are, in addition, Korean sources, which my colleagues who work with Korean can use, and there are some interesting books that come out of working with those. Then you move farther west. The next major ones are the Persian historians, so Juvaini, which is translated into English, but written in Persian. Rashid ad-Din, which is in Persian, but translated a couple of times into English. Then there's the god-awful Vasaf, which is a Persian chronicler written in Persian, not translated and difficult to read, but essential. And there are many other Persian historians who cover a piece of the Mongols in Iran, different time periods, etc. And if you want an entire list, I can certainly give you that. Then you have the Arabic sources. There's not much there. It's scattered throughout, but they'll say things that nobody else will say, so you have to look at those as well. Another important place to go is the Armenians, most of whom are translated into French or English. The Armenians, of course, were, when the Mongols moved into Iran under one of the Purple Arrows, which is the campaign of the 1250s, after Sorkhotani's son took over. So the Armenians ended up working for the Mongols, and so they have a number of, first being terrified by them and then working for them. So they have a number of sources as well, and they give information that nobody else has. There's one history of Georgia in French, translated into French, unless you read Georgian. And then there are other sources, there are a bunch of European sources. There's the Great Hungarian Chronicle, but it's problematic. I don't read Hungarian. If you have about 15 languages, you can read all of them. No one seems to have those, though, and so what we all do is just cooperate with one another and hope that we'll come at some version of what actually happened from time to time. Does that give you some idea of what's out there? But it's very broad, and so that's what makes this topic so hard, is every single source has its own problems, and it's not like the Arabic sources that I worked with before this book, they all relate to one another at least. Here, oh, I forgot the Europeans who come across, the friars, and of course Marco Polo, whom So, I think those are the major ones. Yes, Emily.
I might be off on my history here, but isn't it after 3 or 4 generations, at least part of the family becomes Muslim, no?
Mm-hmm.
So what happens, I don't know how far you take this story up, but does anything change in gender relations with the introduction of Islam?
Well, Muslim scholars, at the time fuss about the marriage practices of the Mongols, which involve not only multiple wives, which is not a problem in Islam, but certainly more than 4 wives. And it also involves this practice called the levirate, where when a man died, one of his sons would marry all of his widows except his own mother. So the Muslim sources really did not like this habit. They were concerned by it. So when the Mongols do convert to Islam, and of course in Iran that starts about 1295, they continue these practices. It's a version of Islam that has space for Mongol custom, which just carries on. And so Muslim sources really are bothered by that. But the main source on women in the Ilkhanate, for the Mongols in Iran, one of them is Rashid ad-Din. He writes the most about women. And he, of course, works for the Mongols. So he occasionally fusses a little bit, but he still carries on describing things in a useful way. And so conversion does not sort of affect the sources enough for it to be a problem. You sort of notice it. The later historians may throw in some pious formulae, but they still have to describe the reality that they're dealing with, which may or may not have any connection to Islamic habits, but that's what they still describe. So in terms of the sources themselves, there's not a lot of noticeable change other than some standard phrasings when conversion happens. And the practices, from what I've seen, do not appear to differ, at least not until 1335, and I don't go later than that. Yeah.
Okay, last questions? We have time here?
Yeah, so it seems like you're painting a very universal picture of, I was just trying to think of other research where if we were to start inserting women, especially in purges and palace intrigue and any elite networks really where you are able to gather information about how the women lines were connected.
Mhm.
You probably see that. I'm curious if you think there's something particularly interesting about the Mongols, or why you chose this particular case. That rewrites the history in a particularly different way than if we were to do this to a lot of cases.
Well, I'm not sure that the behavior of women is specific to the Mongols here, but this is a topic that has been somewhat overlooked until recently by historians of the Mongols. And so everyone who works in this field knows these names and their various accomplishments, but the discussion of them is sort of picking up what the sources say and then moving on to the important stuff, which is the manly story. And the work that has been done is very good, but the degree to which women have just been skipped over is astonishing. So part of it is a bit revisionist. In the book, obviously, what I've described here is just pieces from multiple chapters. And in the chapters, I go into much more depth about all of these topics, plus some other political things that I did not touch on here. But were Mongol women special or different from others? One of the things about Mongol society that made authors of the sources very uncomfortable was the ordinary degree to which women were in charge, ran things, ran these huge camps, appeared in public foray all the time, made decisions, engaged in diplomacy, met with diplomats and sent things off to them, engaged in trade. Many of the authors, the Chinese authors, are very uncomfortable with this. The Persian authors also think this is a little bit unseemly. What are they doing? They're supposed to be a little bit quieter, more dutiful, and out of sight. So it is not that the behavior is different from the behavior of elite women in the medieval period who have access to wealth, power, and opportunity. It is that in the field, it's been suppressed by the sources themselves, and then it has been simply not picked up on by historians. One of my colleagues has a book coming out in March on this topic, but before him, honestly, I could not say of a single book on what women do. So this is, if you will, remedial. Yeah?
Would you say that this particular moment is also a moment of transition in that respect? Or you mentioned the disinheriting of the daughters.
Mm-hmm.
Again, I don't know how far you take this in the future, but of the sense of the Mongol women as special and particularly public diplomatic figures.
Well, when compared to some of the other women in their societies, they were perhaps more visible and more, not just more visible, but it was expected that they would run things. It was normal and expected that they would share this particular part of work that enabled the empire to run. It was expected that there would be particular women in charge of 10,000 soldiers, not a problem, because of her position. So, ask your question again.
Well, for one thing, I realized that it fragments in the four different inheriting parts of the empire. But it just strikes me that this may also mark the point of transition for women's roles, right? As to the kind of status that they held under Genghis and maybe before Genghis versus their status in the Yuan dynasty, the Ilkhanate.
In the Yuan dynasty, from what I've seen from my colleagues who work on that, the Chinese authors are very anxious to shoehorn women into traditional Chinese roles and leave them there. And Mongol women are not particularly interested, nomadic women I should say, are not really interested in fitting those roles. But their behavior does not always please their Chinese subjects. And that remains the case until the Mongols are thrown out of China, at which case you have a different regime coming in, different habits, etc. In the Golden Horde in Russia and Central Asia, the problem with the Golden Horde is that there are no internal sources, certainly not from this period, and so who knows what's going on there. I mean, what I have on them is from this Persian author. I mean, it's very difficult to work on them. So probably much was going on, and the glimpses we have suggest that women's roles there were comparable to what they had been back in Mongolia in the empire period, not the pre-empire period, because the pre-empire period is one of real strife in society, and so there women are in much more danger of being kidnapped, violence, death. There's a lot more of that right before Genghis Khan. So their positions before Genghis Khan are quite awful. Then those who are in his family or brought in, whether by force or not, their positions do improve significantly. So women in the empire have much more power than they had had previously. In the Ilkhanate, well, in the Chagatai Khanate in the middle, again, few sources and late, so we can't really talk about them. We try, but we can't really. And then in the Ilkhanate, the authors like to describe everything as harem politics in a disparaging way, but we see these roles continue on down to the end of the Mongol period and then into the post-Mongol period. So, yeah.
You mentioned just now the shift from pre-imperial conditions to imperial conditions, and that the status of women was elevated and they were...
Well, certain women.
Right, that was my question.
Yeah.
Is this limited to more or less exclusively the imperial court? Did the status of women overall not change from the transition from pre-imperial to imperial, and it was only individuals in specific families?
I don't think we can talk about the status of women in general during the empire period because it depends on who you are. So if you are a Chinggisid or married into the Chinggisids, you have one status. If you're the maid who works for the Chinggisids, then you have a very different status. If you're setting up the bed and your mistress's husband comes along and decides to have sex with you, which we have a sad example of that, too bad for you, you're a maid, you're out of luck. So it really depends on who you are in the society. If you are the wife, if you are from an artisan family and you're a woman and you're captured in Baghdad, you're going to be made to walk across Mongolia and across Central Asia to Mongolia and settle there, where you'll then work for the rest of your life, either for a prince or a princess. Either one can have you, and you're not technically owned, but it doesn't really matter because you can't go anywhere. So you can't I am generalizing in this lecture, but that is about this imperial level because that's all we have in the sources. I'd love to write about other women, but other than anecdotes, they're not really there. So I can't get at them in any systematic way. But there is no possible generalization you could make about how these women act and how other women act because there's such variety. And then, of course, you're looking at multiple societies. So how women act in China, some of my colleagues have worked on that, but it's different from how women act in Iran, and which ones are we talking about? Are we talking about the wives of scholars? Are we talking about the wives of ordinary tribesmen who fight for the Mongols but are on the lower level? There's such a range that to approach that topic would be really nice, but I can't imagine doing it in all practicality. Have I answered your question?
Yeah.
Yes?
Just to generalize. I had understood that in nomadic societies, the religious shamanism gave women a religious role because they could become shamans. Did you get any sense from the sources that is very much in that culture during the period you're looking at? And again, you'd have to generalize down to the bottom to find out if it helped women's status in any way, how they formed their spiritual lives.
Well, there were certain spiritual responsibilities that were the province of wives, one of which is mourning the dead and all the appropriate ceremonies connected with that. As for shamanism, there are some female shamans, but no individual female shamans play a role in the formation of the empire. And in fact, Genghis Khan himself is wary of shamans, has an important one killed early in his reign, and tries to assume all shamanic power himself. After him, there is somewhat of a return to consulting shamans, but we don't really know who they are. So they might have been women, but they might not have been. Meanwhile, one thing that royal wives do, or imperial wives do, is patronize particular religions. So Sorkaktani was a Nestorian Christian. She had a chapel that went around with her. Her cousin, whom she married to one of her sons, was sent to Iran with the son as his senior wife, and the cousin is thought to have interceded on behalf of the Christians in Baghdad. During that capture, she got people, her husband gave her presents and things from the Christians in Baghdad, and they were allowed to live, unlike much of the rest of the population, because of her influence. So we do see women playing very important roles religiously, but it depends on the individual which religion it is. Shamanism is only one of them. It's not even a first among equals. It's one possibility. But female shamans do not play a political role that I've been able to see in this period. Have I answered your question?
Yeah.
Good.
Okay, I think we'll try not to exhaust you here.
Oh, please.
Thank you so much.
You're very kind. Thank you.